Hey, Safia. It looks like it's just us two, so we weren't expecting that, I don't think. But
yeah, we were having technical difficulties right before this call. So this is like the live demo of conference talks. We were waiting on our co-host, Jeffrey.
Hey, there I am.
Oh.
Whew. Hey there. Technical difficulties, challenges getting started. Big thanks to our friend Myra helping us out today. Yeah, how you doing, Safia and Stefan?
Doing great. How are you?
It's that run up to a new version of .net, and we're almost done previews, right? So I've got this excitement of, oh my gosh, we're getting there. It's almost September. Release candidate season is coming, so I'm getting excited. And I know you two have been busy. You've got new features that you're working on around authorization and ahead of time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we heard a little bit from our friends David and Damien at Build about AoT, but Auth is a big topic that I've started experimenting more with in .NET 7, and I've heard we've got some big updates coming for that. So we should dive in and talk about these, shouldn't we?
I think so. Yeah. So I'm Stefan. I've really switched a lot of my focus to Auth in .NET 8, and It's been a fun learning experience for me. It's a very deep, complex topic. In my past, I've worked more on, say, like Kestrel and Signalar. So, it needs to be secure, but, we're not dealing with like identity and stuff at that layer. So this is something we're working more with. And I wanted to talk about two things in particular that I've been spending time on. Let's see, maybe if we can start sharing my screen, we can just like dive right in. But basically, are we sharing my screen yet? Can I look?
Yep,
okay, yeah, let's see, this is the problem with presenting on one screen. So inception moment. So there's two big things I want to talk about. The first is Map Identity API. So for those of you who've heard of like ASP.NET Core Identity UI, those are Razor pages, and maybe not everyone has seen that. So if we just like set that as our startup project and run it, I can give you like a quick rundown what it is. But
now this isn't those user ID pages that you have when you add the identity capabilities into your Razor pages or MVC app. This is different.
Correct. So right now I'm just giving you a quick rundown for those of you who might not be familiar with the Razor pages, what those look like, because this is a Razor page. But, so I'm just going to, basically it gives you a way to register an account. I can put my name in here. I can put my real age. And, it's using a real database, unlike the in-memory database in my sample. So we'll just do that. And, it sends some email. That's kind of like something we'll be looking at later. Allows you to do some confirmation and stuff. And then typically, you can click to confirm your account here in the login flow. And then you can, log in, autocomplete, get your, management endpoints. You can set up 2FA, reset your password, all that. Great. So the problem that a lot of people have is like, what if I'm doing, React, Angular, a mobile app, a desktop app?
Yeah, I had somebody ask me this question today. Gosh, real great to set up with Razor pages and MVC, but for a spa, what do I do? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Right. So this is the answer to that question, hopefully, for a lot of people. So there's two things to note about this. One, the authentication scheme we're using here is cookies. It works well in browsers. And another thing is that, we're using Razor pages. So if you don't have a browser, it ends up not being as good of a solution. But we have a very modular identity system, which allows you to pretty easily customize it. And we are demonstrating this with this new thing called Map Identity API. So you might, you've seen map get, map post, you can map various endpoints. In .NET 7, we introduced map group, which allows you to, give a common prefix to a bunch of APIs. And then in .NET 8, we introduced this map identity API of T user.
Okay, so let me just pause you there for a second and back up. You said something there that you went by really quickly, and I'm not sure that the folks watching caught it, right? The API and interactions we have with identity right now are good if you have a browser, right? It's good if you're displaying a user interface, but where you're going is if you have an API. So not just an API. I'm guessing, right? So logging in and access minimal APIs, other standard controller APIs, and also maybe if I'm building like a mobile application and I need to log in and I need that API endpoint. That's what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So, and then if we can, hopefully it will autocomplete the Swagger stuff, but if not, so yeah, so basically it's adding a bunch of API endpoints. And right now I'm working outside of the ASP.NET Core repo on some pretty recent bits. And one thing to note about the ASP.NET Core repo is that you don't get like the nice swashbuckle UI or something. So that's what I was attempting to do here for a second. But then I forget what the default URL is. It's like swag or something. But maybe
slash
index
V1,
HTML. Yeah, maybe something like that, right? Yeah. So if we refresh this, we are going to ignore this for a second, and then we are also going to hopefully be able to switch to my other Windows desktops. All right, this is bad on my side. All right, back to where we were. So anyway, we'll ignore the Swagger UI for a little bit. And what I'm going to do the rest of this demo with is we're using this new HTTP feature that we've introduced to Visual Studio. For those of you who might have watched previous community stand-ups have seen this. This is like kind of the .NET REST. This is a little bit like the HTTP REST client plugin in VS Code. Now it's been integrated in Visual Studio. I think writers had it for a little while. So what this program is a sample project in the ASP.NET Core repo. Like I said, we've set up identity with an in-memory, we set up like the identity entity framework stores with in-memory database. And then we've called this like add identity API endpoints. And this is important for map identity API to work. So this adds the services that we need. And if we have 12 into this, it's calling a bunch of like map post, map get, and it's adding like register, login, and we'll go into like what the other endpoints do. So it's like kind of corresponds a bit one-to-one to the Razor pages, but it's now accessible from SPA or native app that you can do like custom UI with. So really quick, let's just run this sample, and then let's we can send a request to an anonymous endpoint. I'm gonna sign out really quick, and I'm gonna go get a little ahead of ourselves. But if we hit an authenticated endpoint, you'll see we get like a 401 unauthorized here. And over here, right, that's just using, mapget requires auth, hello, username, require authorization, right? So that's our authenticated endpoint that I just tried to hit without logging in, right? That requires auth endpoint. So to make that work, we're going to want to pass a bearer token. And the question is, like, how do you get a bearer token? There's this thing called OIDC, which is great for when you want to support, if you're like a Google or a Microsoft or a Facebook, right? And you want other applications that aren't necessarily even written by you to be able to log in using your identity provider. That's good. We also recommend, using Azure, AD or Entra for like this kind of stuff in big apps. But certainly for like developing and testing things with identity, and for like a lot of smaller apps, maybe like line of business apps, we think this is a great solution. So without further ado, You see that, we got this 401 earlier when we hit that authenticate endpoint. So like, how do we log in, right? So first we have to register. You can see I've already set up some, pre-canned requests here. I'm going to be example@example.com. And this is a password that meets all our requirements, right? So if I was to like send this request and not have like probably capital letters or something, and I do not know why the scroll bar just went crazy. Sorry, guys. You'll
Hot
see
bits.
that
All fresh stuff, right?
yeah, for sure. So you'll see, okay, yeah, you have requirements for the passwords, right? We're doing problem details, right? So it must be at least 6 characters, got some alphanumerics and all that. So I obviously picked okay, let's see, I have way too many windows. This is probably not great. All right. All right. So sorry about that. Can you all hear that? Am I sharing audio too? The bell. All right. Anyway. Okay, that's good. So we'll send this request and we'll log in. And we'll get that email confirmation that we got before right here. And we can even like copy that for a second so we can test that later. So we'll copy this link to confirm the email if we want. So this is something where you would typically write, an iEmail sender yourself that takes send email async. And this is the same thing you use with Identity UI for what it's worth to do like email confirmation. So you can use like Azure has a service to send email and yeah.
So actually, there's a couple questions here in chat as you're going through and showing us that the API does let us log in. The folks are asking those similar identity questions when we're working with the user interface. Similarly, when we're working with the API, can we swap out to use Azure authentication as a provider or store our data in Cosmos DB instead of SQLite or something else on-prem?
Yeah, so Identity has a lot of abstractions as far as user stores. We don't ship one for Cosmos DB that I know of. I think the only identity store that we as like the aspnetcore team ship is an EF-based one, right? Which isn't just SQL Server; it's just anything that EF supports. However, there are already community stores that support things like Cosmos, and that's something that we've been considering, like writing more samples for and stuff. So if that's something that you want, we can definitely talk about it. Also, like as of right now, there's no easy way with Map Identity API to use like Google or Azure AD like access token to log in and associate that with your identity account. But Identity itself supports external login providers, so you could extend this a little bit, and I'm going to show that if we have time, how you can kind of add your own endpoints, and that's definitely feedback we're interested in. Is like how many people want to use their own Cosmos DB stores with external login provider, and we think that's a good pattern, and that's why those system supports it.
Right, you'd want to be able to log in with your Microsoft account, your GitHub account, your Google account. Absolutely.
Exactly. So, and Identity UI supports that, so the system supports that. But like Map Identity API with the login endpoints that we have currently do not. But you can call APIs yourself, and we can get a little bit into how that's implemented. But really quick, so we've just successfully registered this user, and now we can log in using the identity login endpoint. One thing to note, I kind of glossed over this a little quickly earlier, is this identity prefix isn't like hard coded in Map Identity API. That's coming from Map Group. If you just called like app.mapidentity API, you would just be making a request like straight to login, right? It's kind of like an interesting thing there. So once we log in with this user, we get a bearer token and a refresh token. You see this expires in value of 3,600 seconds, which equals an hour. That's how long the access token is good for. So if we want to then copy and paste this access token, I'm going to put that in the HTTP variable, and then we can hopefully make authenticated requests. So that's just the easiest, earliest part of the demo. Is like we have a user.
And this is the map identity API is just exposing what you configured in your in the builder for configuring the identity authentication service, right? So all of these things are a product of what was configured previously.
Sure. So you can, like, for example, here, right, in add identity endpoints, this takes like options.
Exactly. So
and you can do like options, say like password options. There are of various kinds, right?
That cookie duration length.
Yeah, for example.
Right. As you were talking about, that's what got me thinking here. Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of things are configurable like that. So
the key thing that I want to make sure that folks that are watching, our viewers, are hearing is they don't have to configure something different for their identity than what they've already been doing. You can just say map identity API and it will pick up those other configuration options you're already using elsewhere in your project,
right.
and continue working. Fantastic. Okay.
Right. And to be clear, like identity UI and map identity API are using the same stores. Therefore, like you can use both in the same web app, and you can sign in using whichever you want. So yeah, I think it looks like I successfully copied and pasted the token. And if I have, you'll see that, I still can't make request that's authenticated without sending the token, right? So, here's a request that's just to get, I didn't set the authorization header, so it failed with a 401. I hope this is like big enough for people to see, but if not, right? And then if you add this bearer token that we just got from the login endpoint, which then you saw me store into a variable earlier, and send that, it should work. And then you'll get hello example at example.com and so forth. And then we can also see some information about the users. So for instance, if we hit this manage info, which currently in the Preview 7 release is called account info. So we did some renames there. There will be a break and change announcement. You can see, your email, whether it's confirmed, and various claims you may have. The names of these claims are also configurable. Some people don't like all the SOAP, but that is the default. It has been an identity for a long time. But you can, use things like that are shorter. And then you can, like, for example, confirm email, right? So, or let's also discuss. So we're not going to wait an hour for our access token to expire, but you'll notice that when we did sign in, we got a refresh token, and you're allowed to use it early. So the way that works is, if you're coming up near the expiration, we would want you to then send the refresh endpoint or send the refresh token to the refresh endpoint, and then you'll get a response that's identical to what you had before.
Yep.
But you don't have to. You don't have to, right, exactly. You can just store the refresh token and not like the user password in your app, which would be like, bad for security potentially. So this mitigates that. This will also do a security stamp check. So if anything changed about the user, it would fail. So for instance, like I can repeatedly send this refresh request and it will continue to work because the refresh token, it doesn't expire for several days by default. It's similar to cookies with the timeout. So it has a much longer expiration than the hour that the access token normally has. However, let's say something about your account changes. Like let's say you confirm your email or you change your email. I'm going to resend the confirmation email really quickly. I copied this earlier, but I think I lost it in my clipboard. So I'm going to copy it again. One thing to note is this is already HTML encoded, so this should work if you get it in like a normal email client, but we got to be careful when confirming the email here, because if we don't,
And while you're typing that, we've got a bunch of really good questions coming in there, primarily on YouTube, I'm seeing at this point. We'll be sure to get to it. We've seen all your questions. We're going to get to those in just a little bit. We want to wait, make sure Stefan gets through what he wants to show us here.
Yeah.
And then we'll go through and chat about some of these.
Yeah. But I'm excited for the questions. So anyway, so hopefully this will confirm the email. We'll get a 200 response if I can unpause the debugger. It's probably mad that I added an extra / Let's try. Yeah. Okay.
There you
200.
go. 200. Okay.
Okay. And then now, once we hit that info endpoint again, what we should see is, because the access token is still good, we should see that the email is confirmed. Exciting. What's notable is the refresh request that was repeatedly working earlier no longer will. So you'll be logged out in an hour, maybe. I tried this earlier. Okay, never mind. There are certain, so changing email definitely will reset the security key stamp. There's a bunch of tests around this, but we'll move on. So the next thing we'll talk about is 2FA, which you can set up. So for this user, we'll see that is two-factor enabled is false, which is like the default same as identity UI when you set it up. And then you get this shared key, which typically is used to display a QR code, right? That is then goes to an authenticator app. And then in that authenticator app, every 30 seconds or so, it shows you a new code. So we have some instructions, and we'll document this. It's also there in like identity UI, which is like, here's how you set up like a QR code generator. But for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to run the code in, it used to be called .NET Interactive, now it's Polyglot Notebooks. So I'm basically taking the current time, figuring out the time step, doing some TOTP, I forget exactly what that stands for, time is part of it. And then it gives you code. And then hopefully with that code, we can enable it, right? So here I have an old code, right? So if I send that, it's gonna like reject it. It's gonna be like bad request. The 2FA token you provided with the request is invalid. But if I put in the new code, which I got like less than 30 seconds ago, it should be forgiving enough, even though I've taken a little bit of time talking. Like, let's hope it works, right? Yeah, so it does. So now you'll see that is two-factor enables true. We've got like a bunch of recovery codes. I'll copy one of those just to kind of show how that works. So yeah, you can use the recovery code and you can log in that way. So note that now that we've enabled 2FA, yeah, we can just like rerun the login endpoint, right? And it's gonna fail because it requires two-factor. We just set that up, right? So now, along with the password, if you want it to work, if you get this like requires two-factor result, you send the password together with the two-factor code or the two-factor recovery code. So, I mean, I guess it makes more sense to show the mainline scenario first. So let's get a new two-factor code. I can just rerun this, right? Because the shared key is the same as before. And then I can log in with that. And then we get a login like before. Alternatively, we can use one of these recovery codes that don't expire, but there's like only 10 of them and you can't reuse them. So we got boom. And then if we try it again, it's going to be like, oh, you're unauthorized. And then if we check the info endpoint again, you'll see that like instead of 10 recovery codes left, we have 9. So yeah, it's kind of how it works. There are options to like regenerate recovery codes and so forth. I'm not going to like go through everything because I think I'm already
we're still early in the process here. So
yeah,
there's a ton of questions that have come in. Do you want to take a minute or two here, Stefan, and take a look?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
So lots of folks very interested in how this is going to integrate with their existing applications. Is it Jimmy Scott on YouTube asks, with respect to .NET identity and authentication, is it suitable for multi-tenant applications? Or do you think that Duende or OpenID Dict are better options?
Yeah, so I do think that for multi-tenant applications, which implies that you kind of want single sign-on, is my understanding, for a different tell me if I'm wrong. Yeah, for different kinds of applications. In that case, OIDC server is nice. and there are a lot of client libraries around that. So I think that if you're not doing authentication kind of in the same process / application as the rest of your app, an OIDC server makes sense. And whether you like OpenIDICT or Duende or whatever, we think those have a place, right? We're not trying to replace any of those entirely.
I think you can make identity work with this if you just assign a claim that is the name of the tenant that these folks are associated with, and then use that tenant to filter appropriately as folks log into the application or route appropriately, right?
Right. Yeah. So I guess the key here is that right now, this map identity API will sign in with two potential authentication schemes. There's the one that existed before, which is the application cookie scheme. And then there's this new bearer token scheme. One thing that I will note that maybe I haven't made clear enough about this token right here is it's not a JOT bearer token. It's actually kind of more similar to a cookie in that it's encrypted stuff. But it is still a bearer token in that it's sent as part of the bearer authorization header and so forth. So it is tied to the application, right? You can only authenticate things using that application's authentication schemes, right? So in this case, it's those two. So it's not ideal for authenticating, outside of that ASP.NET Core application.
Okay. Some other questions coming through here. If a user got a token and that user was then disabled and invalidated, does it also invalidate the token?
No. So this is similar to it invalidates the refresh token basically if you change the security stamp. So eventually the access token will expire in an hour. This is pretty similar to how cookies work. So where with cookies, when you sign out, right, you're trusting the client, generally the browser, to respect the fact that you told it to delete the cookie. But if someone really wanted to keep using a cookie after you signed out, they could just save it, right, and continue sending it. And because we don't take a database hit on every single request, only on the refresh requests, the access tokens don't get invalidated; they just expire.
Okay, that's not too bad. You can dial back then how long that access token is valid.
Correct.
In your identity configurations, if you want to reduce that, that attack vector.
Yeah, and to be clear about this, right? So this gets into a little bit of how add identity endpoints works. So by default, I'm calling this add identity endpoints that adds both the cookie and the bearer token authentication. I'll show really quick that it's possible to sign in with cookies, right? So there's this use cookies equals true, and this is going to fail at the moment because I just enabled 2FA. But if I quickly get a code, it would work. But let's see if I can how fast I can say it. Two-factor code. All right, send it. Right, so 200. So it worked, right? So now I can make that original request that failed, right, because it didn't have any bearer token header, and it's going to succeed. And the reason it's going to succeed is because Visual Studio just automatically sends cookies, even if it doesn't tell you that it is. So if we put a breakpoint here, and then we did this request, we can kind of work our way up the call stack and look at the HTTP context and so forth. And by the way, shout out to James who put a bunch of debugger display attributes on HTTP context, which makes it way nicer. So yeah, you can look at request cookies, and I know this is super small. Probably I was going to try to zoom in,
it's not too bad.
Yeah. Anyway, cookies, right? So now we have the application cookie and so forth. And
okay,
yeah. some two-factor stuff.
There's a handful of questions that are also here asking, this feels like this is getting us closer to being able to replace Identity Server 4 with built-in identity.
Yes. I mean, it does fill the gap for certain scenarios, for sure.
Yeah.
It's simpler than an OIDC server, but for like a lot of scenarios, I think it is suitable.
Okay.
Yeah, and then like to finish up my last thought, like this add identity endpoints is adding cookie and bearer token auth, but like all of these are public APIs, right? So another way to do it, and what I was like about to copy and paste kind of to show it, is like you could instead of calling add identity endpoints here, let's see if I can paste. Yeah. Basically, just call add identity core, add API endpoints to the identity builder that is returned by identity core, which I'm like pointing at on my screen, which you obviously can't see, but I can't move my cursor either. Because then we'll lose. Oh, wait, I can. I thought I'd lose the hover text. Anyway, returns an identity builder. And then here, what we did is we only added the bearer token scheme, right? So if we do that and remove this and then restart everything that worked before will still work to an extent, except for the cookie stuff. That's basically what it comes down to. So like, yeah, so you can do that. It's gonna complain because I did the weird thing with the password. I thought I did not mean to do that. All right, boom. And then if I try to log in with the cookie like I did earlier, oh wait. No, it's because I put an extra quote. Yeah, all right, I should remove that breakpoint. And then, yeah, so and then you'll get a hopefully helpful error from like the cookie login, which is like there's no relevant authentication handler.
Okay.
For that. So, but the point, because you're talking about earlier also customizing the expiration on this, you would actually be changing the bearer token options, not the identity token options, because that's like an option that's like relevant to the authentication scheme, which you can technically use without identity. Like you can just call, HTTP context.signin identity constants bearer scheme or whatever, and then continue to use this. And then you can set like bearer token expiration, and obviously you pick longer than a second, but you get the point.
So there are a bunch more questions about how this is going to integrate, and I know we're still early in the development of adding the identity APIs. And I want to make sure we have time for Safia because,
of course,
because there's a bunch more we want to talk about with Safia. Can you follow up with some of the folks on YouTube here and check in there as when we transition over to talk to Safia?
Absolutely. And yeah, I have like kind of hopefully a fun segue that I talked to Safia about. So when we're adding all these app identity endpoints, right? Remember how earlier I said, you can just like sign in with the identity manager you want to. Let's see. I don't have an HTTP context here, so I'm gonna wait. But like, you would be able to in your own endpoint do like return typed results dot sign in, and boom, and like, and then you can change. You can just make the bearer token your default scheme, and you'll get that nice response with the refresh token, the access token, all that. And then if we want to do this, I guess the point I want to make is if we look at all these new map identity API endpoints, it's got some fun stuff with some auto-generated code. And I think Safia can tell us a little bit more about like what is this code generation and why that's calling like into my register handlers and so forth. Hopefully that's the way to end this. Sorry for running long.
Oh no, that was great. I've been sitting in API reviews where Stefan has showcased his work over the past couple of months. He's been doing a really great job on the identity stuff, along with Jeremy, who I think is in the YouTube comments, who is our PM, who's been answering questions and stuff. So it was really nice to see your demo and see kind of everything come together in the end when I've been kind of watching the PRs and the API reviews come in. So it's pretty neat to see Auth being such a big story in .NET 8. The other big story in .NET 8 is native AoT and some of the work we've been doing to support ahead of time compilation for .NET. And we've been talking about this a lot over the past couple of months. Jeff, I think you mentioned earlier that David Fowler and Damian Edwards did a presentation at Build about some of the work that we've been doing. I think they were also at one of the past stand-ups talking about all of the native AoT work that has been going on. So I'd recommend folks check out those videos and our blog posts and all sorts of content for looks at some of the features that we've been building out. And while I was getting ready to do this stand-up, I was thinking a little bit about how I would structure it. And one of the things that I thought would be interesting would be to kind of go through the experience of taking an application in .NET 7, upgrading it to .NET 8, and then enabling publishing with native AoT support, and kind of talking through some of what works, some of what doesn't, and kind of where we're going to go with native AoT moving forward.
Sounds good.
Just like Stefan, I'm going to be living in the code editor for most of my presentation. So if you want to share my VS Code window, awesome, there it is. So cool. I'm starting off here with an application that I've used in the past to demo some .NET 7 functionality. It's available on my GitHub. It's the training API repo on my personal GitHub account. I'll try and post the link to that later so you can see the work. But what I've done is I've taken this application and I have upgraded it to .NET 8. So I've got my TFM upgraded, and I've got all of the packages and dependencies updated. Most of the code has stayed the same. So some of what this application is doing, it looks like I'm using an in-memory database with EF Core to maintain my data. I've got authentication with drop-bearer-based authentication. I've got Swagger to showcase my endpoints with OpenAPI. And then I've got a set of APIs here that are all registered using minimal APIs. And for those who are interested, this is like a quick little app to help a local gym manage all of their trainers and their clients. So I want to take this app. It's been written for .NET 7. I want to upgrade it to .NET 8. I've done all the expected work of like changing TFMs and whatnot. And I've also set the publish AoT build property to true in my application. So when I hit publish, it's gonna compile ahead of time. And let's see what happens when I run .NET build in my application. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, one of the things that you'll observe is that when the publish AoT build property is enabled in my application, that was not supposed to happen. Let me do a clean, and let me do a build again. Live demos, am I right? So
Yes.
with the publish AoT flag enabled, the linker will run at the publish phase of my analyzer. And in particular, what I'm trying to showcase here by running .NET build is that there is a linker analyzer that will run at build time that will kind of statically analyze the code in my application and observe anything that might be a problem for the trimmer and notify me. So what I've done here is I've just done the build stuff in my application. I could see that I've got a ton of warnings from the linker, and they all seem to be related to the map action endpoints in my application. So I've got stuff going on with like map post, map delete, map put. That's kind of a bother. Now, one of the challenges with the experience or the implementation that we shipped for minimal APIs in .NET 6 and .NET 7 is that it takes big advantage of reflection and dynamic code generation as part of its functionality. So whenever you implement an application with minimal API endpoints, at startup, we take a look and we use reflection to inspect the route handlers that you've provided. understand what types of properties and parameters you've provided in your incoming route handlers, and then generate code that can essentially take a look at the HTTP context and resolve parameters of those types from the HTTP context, as well as write responses to the HTTP context depending on what your application is returning. And all of that is using reflection to do the inspection of your route handler and understand what kind of parameters should be bound, and then dynamic code gen to produce the actual code that's going to read the HTTP context, extract whatever arguments from the route or the query or the JSON body, and then write out to it. All of this is not inherently friendly for the trimmer. So as one of the first things that we had to pursue for .NET 8 was figuring out a way to remove our reliance on reflection and dynamic code gen as part of minimal APIs. And we did that. So one of the new things that you will see in .NET 8 is support for what's called the request delegate generator. And I'm going to jump back into my CS proj here. I mentioned a little bit that I had enabled publish AoT in my application, but I did do something else that was a little sneaky, which you'll notice I have on line 9 here, set the enable request delegate generator flag to false. That's actually what's causing me a lot of issues here. I have disabled the compile time code generation for minimal APIs that we introduced in .NET 7. And if I take a stab at removing this, pull out this commit, what I should see now is that doing another build, clean and build of my application will remove those linker warnings. And that is because we are now using compile time based code generation for our minimal API. So I've got no warnings here, at least at build time.
So let me just make sure I understand that right. Yeah. So all the code that you were using reflection to generate, kind of have in memory at startup time, you just moved to build time instead.
Yes.
That's awesome.
The term we've been using has been shift left for a lot of these things, where things get moved earlier and earlier on. So everything that we were doing previously using reflection, we're now doing at compile time using static analysis with Roslyn APIs. And instead of using dynamic code gen with link expressions, we are now emitting code at compile time using an incremental source generator. And one thing that I'll point out to people, if you don't have, if you haven't used source generators a ton in your applications in the past, here's a pro tip. There is a build property called emit compiler generated files. When you enable this build property in your application, it is going to spit out the source code that is produced by your generators to your intermediary output in your application. So if I go here, training API, obj, debug, net80, generated is the directory I'm taking a look at. And then the name of our generator is Microsoft ASP.NET Core HTTP request delegate generator. We make really great names here.
Really long names.
Long names. Stefan is our resident API review guru, so he's got some war stories to share about some of the API names that we've had to review over the past couple of years. So you can
service provider is service.
Oh gosh, yes. Let's not talk about service provider is service. We have fun times in API review. But what's really cool is that you can actually take a look at the code that is generated by the request delegate generator, and you can inspect it yourself. So you can see some of what we're doing here. We are leveraging a new preview feature in the compiler that you may have heard about, I think, in previous stand-ups, called interceptors. Interceptors provide the functionality to annotate a particular implementation of a method. So here I've got this map get 0 method, and I've got this intercepts location attribute, which basically says, hey, for the map get invocation that's defined at this file path, at this line number and in this column, which is, line number 42, column 9. If we head back to our source code for our program CS, we'll see that this matches with our client's map get call. It'll say, hey, if you encounter this line, I would like you to call this code that's been generated at compile time instead of the map get invocation that's in the framework, which uses reflection and link expressions to generate code. Instead, use this one that I've actually generated in my source generator and invoke it. And if you're curious, you can dig into the actual implementation for what's produced by the code generator, but you can actually read through it. And what I think is cool is like you can see what the structure looks like for how we resolve things from the HTTP context. So I mentioned earlier that part of what we do is inspect the parameters of your handler. So here we see you have an ID parameter that's an integer. Well, you probably intended to resolve that from the route parameters or as a query. So we're going to try and extract it from the route or query. We're going to do some checks to see that you've actually provided it since it's a required parameter. So you can actually read through all of the code that's generated here and understand step by step what your minimal API is doing.
So, Safia, there's a question that's come up once or twice here in chat, and it's a decent question. Gosh, all this code that you're generating, is it adding just time to the build process to generate all this code?
Yeah, that is a great question. You're totally right. As a result of this, some of the time that you would have been paying the cost for at startup, you are now paying the cost for at compilation. So it does increase your compile time. Now, what I'm not going to say is that this is like going to balloon your compile time. One of the things that we've actually taken great care of is making sure that the performance impact of adding this generator to your compilation is not great. So it's an incremental generator. For those who are not familiar, source generators have existed in two kind of iterations. The first implementation was kind of iSource generator. And then the second is this incremental generator, which is a little bit smarter about caching certain instances so that when you are, if you haven't modified a particular syntax in your application, particularly if you're running in Visual Studio, the generator is not going to keep running and reproducing code as aggressively. So the generator is incremental. It takes advantage of some caching properties. And then also we have it benchmarked. So you can find the benchmarked code for the generator in the ASP.NET Core repo. And we try to make sure that in its actual implementation, we take advantage of caching. So for example, I mentioned that one of the key properties is that we inspect the types in your application to determine what kind of shape they have and how we might bind to them. And we actually will try and compute that only once and then cache it. So if you have a POCO, like a to-do or a task list that you're using in multiple APIs in your application, we'll run the code to compute whether that might be a parameter that is probably coming from the JSON body or something that is a service. And we'll run that once and then cache it. And so every time you reference it in your endpoints, we're not recomputing it. So yes, the long story short is that, the shift left does mean that you're saving time at startup, which I think is valuable if you're deploying your application.
Sure.
Typically, the compile time cost is a one-time cost, but startup costs you might pay more frequently.
You as a developer, right? Hey, who cares if you take a couple extra milliseconds to compile that one time, if it means dozens of seconds on the front end for all the users interacting? That's a good trade-off.
Yeah. And then again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean we're like punishing you as a developer by like dramatically increasing your build time. It's still a fair trade-off.
There's another comment here in chat I want to make sure that we touch on, and you did answer, and Rizwan had a question about, gosh, you're gonna have to go regenerate every time you touch this file, but you've got it cached, and you mentioned you're able to incrementally improve that. But there is a question here from Big Dub on Twitch. I can't believe I just said Big Dub on Twitch. Asking, well, how does this affect our unit testing process if we're generating some of this code? Are we still able to unit test the code that we originally wrote, but instead it'll be rerouted over to what's being intercepted and delivered?
Yeah, great question. So I think it it depends a little bit on how your tests are structured. So in this demo application that I'm showing you, it does actually contain a test project, which I can open up. And there's 2 layers of testing. One of them is testing for a training API service. So I've got, where is it? If I can find it. Okay, training service. So I've got a training service that does the actual business logic of my application. And I might unit test that. So I can continue to unit test that in its own. It's not strictly related to minimal API. So whatever testing and functionality I have for that will continue to work. It runs at compile time as well. So if you are referencing mapget endpoints in like integration tests, which are showcased in this project as well, those should also continue to work as well, because that interceptor will be able to map the replacements appropriately. So this shouldn't affect things too much, particularly if like you're unit testing individual components within your application. And if you're doing integration testing with like the MVC testing package, it should work much the same.
Okay. There was a further question about, you added Open API to this project. That was something that you added, not strictly required to get this benefit. That was more to generate your Swagger endpoints and all that.
Yes. And that actually leads me to the next portion of this presentation. That was a really good segue, whoever asked that question.
You're welcome.
I've run the linker analyzer at build time. I haven't actually run a publish step yet, so I'm not able to see all of the trimming and AoT related errors or warnings in my application. So let me do that now. And I'll preface this by saying what I'm kind of leading to is one of the kind of first things that doesn't work super great in my application when I've got a native AoT enabled, which is Open API and Swagger. So if we take a look, here is me actually running the publish step, and you'll see that I'm getting a set of warnings from the linker itself related to references to Swashbuckle, aspnetcore swagger.net, Open API, API Explorer in my application. If you're familiar with how the Open API infrastructure in ASP.NET Core works, you'll recognize some of these types and assemblies as kind of related to supporting getting an Open API document out of my application. It's not inherently trim or native AoT friendly for much of the same reasons that the request or the minimal API layer is not, which is that we need to reflect or use reflection to understand the parameters that are provided to our endpoints in order to be able to produce an Open API document that represents them. So this is kind of one of the first things we'll encounter that we don't have like a super neat solution for at the moment, like we do, where you can just enable the request delegate generator and kind of things will magically work in your application. So native AoT is a big effort. It's not like we can just spend a couple months working on it and then everything works for all of our framework implementations and all of the open source libraries. So we will encounter some things that don't work. Open API and Swashbuckle is one of those areas that does not support native AoT as of .NET 8. There's some interesting ideas I've prototyped around using source generation to produce Open API files at compile time in much the same approach that we're using for minimal API. So yes, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to use any of the Open API infrastructure with native AoT. And if you hit these issues, one of the things I would recommend, and one of the things I'm showcasing in the demo here, is that for some scenarios, Open API might purely be a development time experience. So something that you as a developer are using when you're debugging and building to test your APIs. I actually have been using the HTTP client that Stefan was showcasing earlier pretty extensively. So I don't use Swagger UI as much now that I have it kind of embedded in my editor. So one of the things that you can do is omit the compilation or introduction of those Open API related types in your application if you're building it in release mode. So that is one of the things that you can do here. again, not an ideal solution. This is hopefully something that we're going to continue to improve on in future releases. But what I've done here is I've stuck all of my OpenAPI related things behind an if debug, if def.
Yeah.
It's not going to be compiled into my published release bits. Since for my particular situation, I don't need it in a production environment. There are some situations definitely where people want to have their OpenAPI JSON as part of their deployment so that other developers can see it and examine it. But that's something that we hope to support in the future with some of this work.
That's going to be left shifted also.
Yes, lots of things to left shift and work around. But for now, this is kind of how I'm approaching it in my application.
Okay.
So that was a great question for whoever asked
that. Yeah. I'll grab that name real quick. So the native AoT stuff, really, it's moving things, it's left shifting things so that we can get that better startup. And really, this is one of those things that you want in your container app, so you get that instant start, in faster startup of these things. Removing the reflection is only going to make it better for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for those of you who are curious to see some of the numbers behind this, I recommend checking out the Preview 3, the .NET 8 Preview 3 blog post has some numbers that showcase some of the improvements that you get for turning on native AoT in your application.
Okay.
The .NET 8 Preview 7 blog post shows some of the improvements you get with enabling the interceptors-based minimal API generator in your application. And we've got public performance benchmarks that you can check out as well if you're looking to kind of understand the numbers behind this.
And we know our friend Stephen is going to be putting together a performance blog post coming up here in the next month or so. He's usually due for something in a release candidate cycle.
Yes, and Brennan on the ASP.NET team also will publish an ASP.NET specific performance blog post. So keep an eye out for that as well.
All right.
I do have a couple more things to showcase. We can jump ahead if we don't want to do the play-by-play.
Okay.
There's two other things that we kind of need to address in our application. One of them is the fact that I am using EF Core. EF Core is one of those things that is not quite set up for native AoT in .NET 8. There are issues on the EF Core repository that are kind of tracking the work involved. It's a pretty huge undertaking. So if you're curious about that, check that out. So as a substitute, instead of using EF Core, what I can actually do is take advantage of some of the more lower level data access APIs that exist. So there is NPG SQL, which is the .NET API for interfacing with Postgres. And then there is also the Microsoft Data SQLite library or package, which is for interfacing directly via kind of raw data access with SQLite. Both of those are native AoT friendly. And what I've done in my application is I have swapped my dependency on EF Core for a dependency on the SQLite APIs. And I'm using that here to write SQL, which I really had to dust my SQL skills. So please don't judge me if this is not the best SQL ever. But I've subbed my API here for seeding data into my database using SQLite. And I've also changed the implementation of my training service to take advantage of the SQLite library, which is native AoT friendly.
Okay.
And then kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about, this is not new in .NET 8, but you can take advantage of the JSON source generator as well. It kind of follows that same shift left philosophy. JSON involves a lot of serialization and deserialization, which requires inspecting types to understand how they should be serialized or deserialized. So we can kind of take that same philosophy and shift left with the JSON source generator. So I've gone ahead and configured that here. There are wonderful docs on how you can enable the JSON source generator in your application. And so that was kind of the process for me taking my .NET 7 app and then making it native AoT friendly with .NET 8. And that just covers kind of making things compatible. There are also new APIs that we introduced in .NET 8 to make your application size smaller. One of them is Create Slim Builder, which is another wonderful artifact from our API review sessions. So by default, when you create a web application instance using this minimal hosting API, the web app that you get is configured with some defaults. You get a developer exception page. You get a ton of sane defaults, but they might not always be applicable to you. Like you might not need a developer exception page in production. You might totally be fine just getting like raw exceptions thrown at you even when you're developing locally. So the Create Slim Builder is a web application light. So it has fewer things, just the essentials for building your API. It does automatically register authentication and authorization middlewares if you have them if you're in your application. So that can be a way to help reduce application size by reducing the number of dependencies you take on when you implement an application. There's also Create Empty Builder, which configures an empty builder, so no defaults are set for you. You can use that if you want super granular control over what's set in your web application.
It's the do-it-yourself model, isn't it?
Do-it-yourself model. And there's other APIs that we've shipped to reduce the dependencies you take on HTTPS in your application. So that was kind of a little bit of the whirlwind tour of it. We talked a little bit about how you can take an existing app, upgrade it to .NET 8, turn on native AoT. We talked about what works really well and what we've added support for. And we've talked about what the path forward would look like. You know, there's tons of opportunities and things for us to do in this native AoT effort around support with ORMs like EF Core. So the things we talked about around Open API. And then also we've shipped new APIs like this Create Slim Builder and Create Empty Builder to help you have more fine-grained control over how large your applications are.
And I'm assuming, right, we talked a little bit about EF Core as a little bit of a challenge with AoT. I'm assuming Dapper, with how much it uses dynamic and interactions, it's going to have similar challenges to be native AoT compiled.
Yeah. And I think there's been some interesting experimentation on that front as well. But this is definitely a kind of a little bit of a grand effort, and lots of libraries can learn from this. I've seen MVC referenced quite a bit in the code comments. MVC is another one that takes, it uses a ton of reflection. It also will load assemblies dynamically if you're using application parts. So we've done some a little bit of experimentation in the past to see what it would look like to make MVC native AoT compatible. But yeah, it's a fun journey. I've enjoyed working on this stuff over the past couple of months. I want to shout out all of the different individuals. I mentioned the interceptors feature, which is coming as a preview in the compiler. We've done work with folks on the runtime team, aspnetcore, EF Core. So it's really cool to kind of come together as a wider team and community and kind of push for this work.
Just a throwback, you mentioned the interceptors there. Did you have to turn on the interceptors preview feature in your project? Oh.
Yeah, interesting. So this is actually one of the design points that I was quite passionate about making sure was nailed down, which is that as long as you enable publish AoT, specifically for the request delegate generator and the configuration binding generator, which is another kind of shift left generator that we're shipping in .NET 8, you do not need to set the interceptors preview feature flag for those. We automatically will set it for you in the Web SDK. This is kind of as a user nicety to avoid, you know, having like two properties to do one thing in your application, CS proj. So in that particular case, the feature flag is implicitly set for you. But we will be documenting the fact that, you know, it's interceptors under the hood to get some of this stuff working. Yeah.
So right now, the publish AoT is the only way it's enabled in a request delegate generator. I remember there used to be another property. Is it still there?
No, you can actually, if you don't care about any other native AoT things, you can just enable request delegate generator true, and that will turn on the compile time code gen feature. So you can take advantage of the performance improvements that you get with RGG without opting into the whole publish AoT experience. One thing
Do I have to enable the compiler feature then? Sorry to cut you off.
No.
Oh, nice.
So if publish AoT or the enable RGG flag is true, you don't have to enable the compiler feature. Nice. I will say that not everything that works with runtime code gen works with compile time code gen. There are just some things that are impossible to, not impossible, but it can't quite be reasoned through. If your application is, or if your endpoint is returning anonymous types, that's not statically analyzable at compile time, so that's not an experience that we support. If you are trying to reference types in your compilation that are private and don't have like friendly access, it's another scenario we don't support. So as you migrate your application, you might encounter some warnings that basically tell you, hey, we couldn't generate this endpoint at compile time. We're going to generate it at runtime instead. Those are kind of the areas that we're working on improving. So
very cool. All right.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Whirlwind tour.
Yeah. Right. I should call out here. I mentioned Dapper earlier. Mike on YouTube is highlighting there's already a Dapper AoT project. I'll have to check that out. Thanks for sending.
And I believe it also is using interceptors.
Okay.
In its implementation, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, it's happening.
Yeah. Oh man. All right. I am just starting my review, and I like to wait to look at and start implementing things for next versions of .NET as we hit release candidate here. So we are right at that sweet spot where I'm excited to take a look around at all the cool features that we've been talking about and start implementing them in various applications.
Yeah. Between all of what Stefan and I shared, I think you're going to be very busy for a few days with all the new things.
Good. That's right. Let's get that running. Rizwan on YouTube asks, are generics supported?
No, that is another one of the kind of limitations. I assume you're talking about the compile time based RGG approach. So yes, that is another.
Depends on what you mean, right? Because request or map identity API uses it, right? And it has a generic parameter, but you have to kind of do workarounds.
Yes, it's not directly supported. So if you reference generic parameters in your map get endpoints or map action endpoints, we don't support code gen for that. We have done a little bit of design work to discuss how that might look like in the future. So that's definitely on the docket. But I know, Stefan, that was one of the things you ran into, and you kind of had to get a workaround going because you were had a generic referenced as in one of your parameters, and that's not currently supported.
But I definitely encourage any library author who's like using mapget or mappost to use that enable request delegate generator thing, because it's trim friendly if you do it and it works. So.
Yeah, you try it out, report bugs, especially once the RC1 comes out. Keeping me busy fixing bugs.
Yeah, so, and please try out the map identity API stuff too. It is hot and fresh, and we've only gotten a handful of community members using it. I'll admit that there have been some bugs, so I hope to get as many of them quashed before RTM as possible.
We're right at the beginning of this shift left movement, right? I mean, we're going to see more happen. There's lots of .NET versions after this that more can be rolled out through. So all good things. And I like Stefan's point. Let's get some feedback and show performance benefits of all this coming through. Very cool. Thank you, Safia. Thank you, Stefan. This is great. Like I said, I'm excited to look through this a little bit further and get my hands on some of these performance improvements. The identity stuff is a big thing that I'm running into with an application that I'm building. So I'm very interested to see how that works.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, I think, does that bring us to the end of our time together today? I know we're a little bit over. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Just to recap, Safia, can you go over your role, what it is that you do on the team?
Oh gosh, yes. Yeah, I'm a software engineer on the ASP.NET Team. I spend most of my time working on minimal APIs, Open API, some MVC related things. Kind of API layer of ASP.NET Core is my specialty.
Very cool. And Stefan?
Yeah, I've been on the ASP.NET Core team since I graduated college in 2012. Done all sort. Well, back then it wasn't Core; it was just ASP.NET,
right.
MVC, all that kind of stuff.
It was K.
Yeah, this is even before Project K. But yeah, I got to work on some of the early stuff. Like you can blame me for a lot of DI and Kestrel and stuff of that nature. So now I'm working on Auth, which I'll admit I am a little bit new to as well, but I've been quickly ramping up, and it's a fun space.
Very cool. Thank you both so much. And we've got .NET Conf coming up in a couple months. I think we're all looking forward to that and talking more about all the great stuff with .NET 8 when it releases. So I think we're wrapping up there. Thank you both so much.
Thanks,
and it was a pleasure chatting with you, and to everybody out there in chat. Have a fantastic rest of your day. We have some source that we shared, some samples there that we'll post some descriptions and links to those just below here so that you can check out more from what Safia and Stefan showed us. All right.
Awesome.
We'll catch you later, friends. Have a fantastic rest of your day.